Hey guys, welcome to another painting guide. Today I will show you 5 tricks to paint Sisters of Battle if you want to go for the black and red Our Martyred Lady color scheme that you also see on the box art. Painting Adepta Sororitas in their black and red color scheme can be a bit of a challenge because all 3 main elements of that scheme can be pretty hard to paint. Red is already not an easy color to work with if you want nice contrast and you don't want to turn the red into orange or pink, so the robes can be a problem. And then everybody knows how tricky it is to highlight black properly without making it look grey, and here we have almost the whole body covered in black armor. And if that is not enough, this scheme also has white as the main decorative color, and white might look simple, but shading and highlighting it so it looks good is just as tricky as the black. So in this video I will show you how you can use some simple tricks to make your red robes, black armor and white hair, wings and decorations look really good. And in the end I'll share 2 smaller tricks for the skins of the sisters and the cherubim and the purity seals, which you will have to paint a lot for a Sisters of Battle army. I won't go into the details of the other elements here because those can be painted similarly to other armies. But as usual, if you want to learn how I painted the gold and steel non-metallic metal on the standard bearer plus all the other little details, then there is a PDF guide that you can download from my Patreon, where I will also upload a much longer time-lapse video so you can see how I painted her in real time. Alright, that's enough intro, let's start with the red robes. I'll begin from a black prime model here, and some of you might think that it's a much better idea to use white primer or at least a zenithal highlight to start from for red, but that would not allow me to use my little trick and it would make us jump through hoops when we want to paint the black armor. So instead of red, I take staggered and scale green as my first color and I cover the whole surface of the robe with this, using multiple coats to get full coverage. If you're now scratching your head and wondering why I would use this color instead of red, then I suggest watching my video about color tricks that I recently uploaded here on YouTube. A lot of people seem to have found that one useful. But the TLDR version is that anything red will look better if it has a blue or green shadow color instead of simple black or dark red. And since staggered and scale green is a dark blue-green, it will be perfect for our purposes here. Because I'm painting it over the black primer, the end result will be dark enough to serve as a shadow, but it will be bright enough to create a nice colorful red surface over it. Now instead of immediately jumping to a bright primary red, I will choose corn red instead. This color is relatively dark and it has a hint of blue in it, so it will be quite easy to blend it with the base coat. I painted this over the staggered and scale green in a way that covered the raised parts of the robe fully, but left the shadows in the deepest parts less covered with some of the green peeking through. Citadel paints are a little more transparent than the AK Interactive I usually use, so they need more layers to get full coverage, but we can turn that to our advantage. I simply covered the light areas with more layers until they got fully opaque, but left the shadows with less red coats and therefore darker, and the process naturally created a transition between the 2 areas. Now it's time to get that proper red, which will be our mid-tone, the one that will dominate the majority of the robe, and I will use Mephiston red for this. I do the same thing with this one as with the corn red, once again taking advantage of the transparency of the Citadel paints to create a transition just by layering. Simply adding more layers and making the middle of the highlight more opaque while leaving the rest less covered and forming a transition with the previous color. Speaking of which, I make sure to only paint this in the middle of the previous highlights and leave some of the corn red visible when I'm done. We don't want to lose that darker bluish red from the shadows. So now we have staggered and scale green in the deepest shadows, fading into corn red and then ending in Mephiston red in the highest highlights. Time to dial up the brightness a little so we can create more contrast between the shadows and the highlights. I will use Evil Sun Scarlet for this, quite similarly to the previous color, but now on an even smaller area inside the Mephiston red highlights. On top of that, I'm also highlighting all the edges with this, and I make small scratches and marks in the darker areas where there is space for it. This last bit is optional, but I like doing it so the surface looks a bit more interesting and worn. Here is how it looks after this step. The contrast is starting to show now and we are still firmly in the red category and haven't moved into orange or pink at all. Now it is time to do the finishing touches. For this I will use Wild Rider Red, which does have a touch of orange in it, but this much won't hurt us, quite the opposite in fact. I don't paint opaque highlights with this one, instead I concentrate on highlighting those edges and folds that are facing up. And I continue adding tiny scratches and marks in the light areas, intersecting in places where the light would hit the cloth the most. On some of the larger surfaces I use some super thin down glazes of the same color to integrate them into the surrounding area. And that's it for the red. Now I just add a transfer on the larger surface to break it up a bit with some detail, and this is how it looks when it's done. As you can see, we have quite a bit of contrast and you can't really tell that the shadows were done with the blue-green color unless you look for it. It's just there doing its job without being obtrusive. Okay, this is the first big element done. Now let's look at the big ticket item in this color scheme, the black armor. Before doing the red highlights, I actually base coated the black armor with Abaddon Black. The model was already primed with Black Vallejo primer, but the Abaddon Black is a super deep black, which makes it one of my favorite black colors. We want a nice highlighted armor that still reads as black, so it's better to start from as deep a black as possible, so when we lose some of that darkness with the highlights, we will still have enough in the end. Basically, if we have a lot, we can afford to lose some as well. This is not the trick I wanted to show you though, that will come in the third step. For now I will take another nice color from the Citadel range, Corvus Black, and use it to establish the highlights. This is a much less deep black than the Abaddon Black, almost a dark grey, and I am painting this on all the surfaces of the armor that are pointing up to where the light is coming from. It is important to not cover too much of the original black. Ideally the deepest shadows and at least half of the midtones should be left unpainted with this color. I would say I painted around like 40% of the surface. And the difference between the two can be quite subtle. I am not sure how visible it is on the camera, but you can definitely see it in real life. Now for the trick. I take some of the corn red that I also used on the red robes and I thin it down to a very thin glaze. I add something like 80-90% water to the paint on the wet palette. Then I make sure to remove most of the moisture from the brush on a paper towel and I start painting what remains into the shadow areas of the armor. If I thinned it properly, the first coat barely shows up on the black, but then I come back again, and with each consecutive layer the red becomes more obvious. As I do this, I concentrate the subsequent layers more and more into the middle of the highlight, so it creates a transition that goes from full black to super dark red and ends in almost full red. And I try to keep the red and the Corvus Black area separated by keeping the darker Abaddon Black between them. The idea here is that the red robes are reflecting on the armor. This makes the armor more interesting and it will also place the model into the scene on the diorama I'm painting it for. I try to keep the effect subtle. The red reflections on the armor should be several degrees darker than the red robes. If it's too red, it will look off. Alright, with that done, now it's time to finish the highlights. I took Ashen Grey and with this lighter grey color I painted all the edges of the black armor and all the volumetric highlights inside the Corvus Black ones. Painting all the edges is the most important thing we can do to make the armor look good. Even without the volumetric highlights and just with well painted edge highlights, it will already look quite cool. The volumetric highlights and the red reflections are the cherry on top that really make it pop though. Now I go even further up in brightness and with Dawnstone I do the same again, but I reduce the size of the highlights even further and I only paint the edges that are facing up. I also make small marks and scratches in the darker shadows with this to make it look like the armor is worn and battered a bit. Just like with the robes, this weathering step is optional, but I think it adds a lot to the end result. Time for the final highlights with Administratum Grey. I don't want the armor to be as bright as the metal, so there is no need to do pure white highlights. This bright grey will be enough for our purposes. I use this mainly to highlight the most prominent edges on the armor and to do some super small volumetric highlights inside the previous ones where there was still enough space, meaning mostly the upper leg and the power pack. Most of the edge highlights I painted were not covering the whole edge. Rather, I covered the part most hit by the light and then I did small dots at the ends to fake a transition. And the end result looks like this. The armor is highlighted but still looks black, and I think the faint red reflections add quite a bit to the effect. Time to paint some white, and there is more of this on Adepta Sororitas models than you might think. This particular model has decorations on the armor, the bleached white hair, and of course the angelic wings of the terrifying little cherub. First of all, I used Administratum Grey to cover the whole surface on all the things I wanted to be white later. Now if you have any experience with mini painting, then you know how you don't paint white by using white paint. If this is the first time hearing about this, then it was probably already worth making this video. So please don't paint white by painting white. We will use some pure white in the end in the highest highlights, but until then I will stick with bright greyish colors. But even with the greys, coverage is an issue over the black. I used 3-4 coats to get more or less full opacity. It doesn't have to be perfect at this point due to the next step, but it should still cover more or less opaquely. And now for the trick in this step. I take some Briar Chill contrast and I cover the whole surface I have just painted. I make sure to cover everything fully, but especially the deepest recesses. This is why I wasn't super worried about the coverage of the grey before. This will get us to full opaqueness even if a little black was visible before. There is no art to this really, it is contrast paint, so I just slap it on and let it do its thing, and then, very importantly, I leave it to dry fully before I touch it again. Now I take Ulthuan Grey, which is the perfect almost white color with a hint of blue in it to highlight the Briar Queen Chill. I paint this over all the raised elements, like the feathers on the wings and the individual strands of hair on the head. I try to leave the bluish contrast paint in the deeper parts between the individual elements, and when I mess up, I reapply a little contrast there to correct the mistake. I painted multiple layers of this to fully cover everything, especially towards the end of the wings and the top of the head to create a little transition between the lighter and the slightly darker areas. And now we can finally use a pure white. I tried out this titanium white from Golden for the first time because I just picked it up in an art supply shop, but any white paint with a good flow should work. Just please don't try ceramic white from Citadel, let's just pretend that paint doesn't exist. I edge highlighted all the individual feathers with this and highlighted the ends a little. On the head, I edge highlighted the individual hairs only on the top half and also painted the white around the top of the head, kinda like a crown. And this is how it looked when everything was finished. It reads as a white overall, but all the details are also visible due to the bluish shading and the brighter highlights. With that, we are done with the 3 most important things you have to paint on Adepta Sororita's models. To recap, we gave the red a nice blue-green shadow, the black armor got some red reflections, and the white elements were shaded with a little blue-gray. Before I wrap up, let me show you 2 quick tips for the skin and the purity seals, because you will be dealing with those on the sisters quite a bit as well. I base coated the skin with Tusker fur, a dark brown color with a little pinkish cast. This is quite dark and covers easily over the black. And from here I went with the usual Cadian flesh tone and Kislev flesh combination for the highlights with 2 twists. First, I glazed a little magenta into the shadows to add a touch of life into the skin. Then I mixed some Dorn yellow into the final Kislev flesh highlight so I can sneak a hint of yellow on there. The magenta in the shadows contrasts nicely with the yellowish highlights, and this gives a lot more depth to the skin than the usual method. Now for the purity seals. I painted the actual seals a nice bright purple color instead of the usual red, so they stand out more next to the red ropes. Painting them red would make them almost invisible due to the large red surfaces on the model. Then I base coated the papers in Steel Legion Drab and then highlighted them up with Ushabti Bone and Flayed One Flesh all the way to pure white on the top edges. That's quite standard so far and it looks decent, but it is also a little boring, especially on the large ones trailing down from the relic. So I thinned down some Abaddon black slightly, and with the tip of the brush I scribbled some wiggly lines on the paper to make it look like there was something written on them. This might look very difficult to do, but it is actually super easy as long as you get the consistency of the paint right. Not too runny because then you only get blotches on the paper, and not too dry because then you will have a hard time getting the paint out of the brush. This won't look good under a microscope, but from an arm's length away on a tiny model like this it will add details and make the paper look more interesting. Alright, with that done, let me show you how the end result looks. She will be standing right next to the ultramarine captain I painted in the last video on the big diorama I'm working on, and I think she will look quite cool in that scene. But let me know what you guys think. Do you like it? Do you use any cool tricks on sisters models to make it easier to paint them? Let me know in the comments. If you have made it this far, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to give the video a like and drop a comment under it. It really helps the channel out. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for their continued support. They are the ones that make this channel possible. Without them, I wouldn't be able to dedicate the time necessary to keep the channel going. And that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys. See you in the next one.